This is a scientific expedition. I'm not going to race.
I'm just going outside. I maybe waste some time.
Welcome to Uncharted Histories, the podcast where we delve into the lives and legacies of figures who dared to push the boundaries of human knowledge and endurance. Today, we're embarking on a journey to one of the most remote, unforgiving places on Earth, Antarctica. And our guide through this frozen wilderness is a man whose name is synonymous with polar exploration, a figure whose story is a complex tapestry of ambition, scientific endeavor, and ultimately, profound tragedy. Captain Robert Falcon Scott. When you hear the name Scott of the Antarctic, what comes to mind? For many, it's a tale of heroic failure, a valiant effort to reach the South Pole that ended in the ultimate sacrifice. But Scott's story, like the continent he explored, is far more layered and nuanced than a simple narrative of triumph or defeat. It's a story of a driven man, shaped by the expectations of his time, by personal hardship, and by an unshakable belief in the value of scientific discovery, even in the face of an epic race against a formidable rival. So let's cast off the lines and set sail back to 1868, to Outlands, near Devonport, England, where Robert Falcon Scott was born. He was the third of 6 children in a comfortably well-off family, thanks to his grandfather's brewery. This was a world of Victorian ambition, where boys of Scott's social class were often steered towards a life in the armed forces. And so, at just 13, young Robert found himself enrolling as a naval cadet on HMS Britannia. He wasn't just a face in the crowd. He was sharp, he was intelligent, and he had a natural affinity for the sea. He quickly distinguished himself, passing out of Britannia in 1883 and beginning his career as a midshipman. The Royal Navy in the late 19th century, during the 1880s and 90s, was a period of relative peacetime. Advancement was slow, competition was fierce. To truly stand out, an officer needed to find a niche, something cutting edge. For Scott, that was torpedo warfare. He qualified as a torpedo specialist in 1891, graduating with first-class certificates. This wasn't just about being good at his job, it was about positioning himself for future opportunities, demonstrating a forward-thinking mind in a traditionally conservative institution. And it was during his service on HMS Vernon, the torpedo training ship, that fate intervened in the form of Clements Markham. Markham was a hugely influential figure, the secretary of the Royal Geographical Society, or RGS. He was a man who could open doors, and he saw something in Scott: intellect, energy, charm. A bond formed between them, one that would dramatically alter Scott's trajectory. But life wasn't just about professional ascent. The late 1890s brought immense personal tragedy and financial pressure. In 1897, his father died, leaving the family in a dire financial crisis. His father had sold the brewery, made poor investments, and left them virtually bankrupt. Scott, along with his younger brother Archie, became the sole providers for his mother and 2 unmarried sisters. Then, in 1898, Archie, who had given up his own military career to take a better-paying job to support the family, tragically died of typhoid fever. Suddenly, the entire burden fell on Robert. The modest salary of a naval lieutenant was barely enough to keep his family afloat. Imagine the weight on his shoulders. Professional ambition, the need for financial security, and this powerful connection with Clements Markham, it all converged. In 1899, Scott heard whispers of a planned British National Antarctic Expedition. The RGS and the Royal Society were organizing it to explore the largely unknown continent. This was his chance. A chance for distinction, for a name, for a way to secure his family's future. With Markham's fervent backing, Scott applied for command, and in June 1900, he got it. He was to lead the Discovery Expedition. This appointment wasn't just a promotion. It was a leap into the upper echelons of polar exploration, a world of grand adventure and immense scientific potential. In August 1901, the RRS Discovery, a specially built, three-masted wooden ship designed to withstand the crushing Antarctic ice, sailed from London. On board was a diverse crew: scientists, naval officers, and a young merchant marine officer who, unbeknownst to them, would become Scott's great rival, Ernest Shackleton. The Discovery Expedition had broad goals. The Royal Geographical Society, as you might expect, was all about geographical discovery, pushing south, and ultimately reaching the pole. The Royal Society, on the other hand, focused on systematic scientific research: meteorology, magnetism, geology, biology. Scott had to balance these twin objectives, a challenge that would define his entire career. They arrived in Antarctica in early 1902 and set up their base camp in McMurdo Sound. The first year was primarily exploratory, and it was here that Scott, along with Shackleton and Dr. Edward Wilson, embarked on a pioneering southern sledging journey in late 1902. Their goal? Push as far south as humanly possible across the Great Ice Barrier, now known as the Ross Ice Shelf. This journey was a brutal baptism of fire. None of them had significant experience with polar conditions. They battled harsh weather, their equipment was often inadequate, and their food supplies were failing. The dogs, poorly managed, began to succumb. Despite these immense hardships, they achieved something remarkable, pushing further south than anyone in history, reaching latitude 82 degrees, 17 minutes south. But the return journey was a disaster. All the dogs died, and the men themselves suffered terribly from scurvy and exhaustion. They staggered back to the Discovery, barely alive. This experience was deeply formative for Scott. It revealed his character as a leader, but it also taught him harsh lessons about polar travel, particularly regarding the use of dogs, a lesson he would grapple with for the rest of his life. It also caused a deep rift between Scott and Shackleton. Shackleton's health broke down on the march, and Scott, perhaps seeing him as a liability or a rival, sent him home on a relief ship in 1903. This decision bred a lingering resentment that would fuel future rivalry. The second year of the expedition saw the Discovery trapped in the ice of McMurdo Sound. But instead of despairing, Scott used this time to lead extensive journeys inland. He explored the McMurdo Dry Valleys and climbed the western mountains, reaching the summit of the polar plateau. These were immense accomplishments, marking the first extensive exploration of Antarctic land for zoological and geological purposes. It demonstrated his commitment to the scientific aspects of the expedition, even when the primary goal of reaching the pole was out of reach. Finally, in 1904, the expedition was rescued after the RGS and Royal Society dispatched 2 relief ships to break the Discovery out of the ice. When Scott returned to Britain, he was a national hero. The Discovery Expedition was hailed as a triumph of geographical discovery and scientific achievement. Scott was promoted to captain, showered with honors, and tasked with writing the official account, The Voyage of the Discovery. He had achieved the distinction and financial stability he had so desperately sought. But the ice, as they say, had gotten into his blood. The Antarctic had a magnetic pull on him. For the next several years, Scott resumed his conventional naval career, serving at the Admiralty and commanding battleships like HMS Victorious and HMS Albemarle. But he was a changed man, now a figure of international renown, and he watched intently as others pursued their own polar ambitions. In 1907, his former subordinate, Ernest Shackleton, launched the Nimrod expedition. Shackleton pushed south to within a mere 97 miles of the South Pole, setting a new record and proving that the pole was indeed attainable. This fueled Scott's determination. He had unfinished business. He needed to return and claim the pole for Britain. By 1909, he was actively planning his second major Antarctic expedition. These years also brought significant personal change and happiness. In 1908, he met Kathleen Bruce, a talented sculptor, a woman of independent spirit, artistic talent, and wide social connections. They met at a dinner party, and despite Scott's demanding preparations for his upcoming expedition, they fell in love. They married in September 1908, and a year later, their only child, a son named Peter Markham Scott, was born. Peter, named after Peter Pan, would go on to become a renowned ornithologist, conservationist, and founder of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Kathleen introduced Scott to a new social circle of artists, writers, and intellectuals, broadening his perspective beyond the insular world of the Royal Navy. It was a period of profound personal happiness and stability, a stark contrast to the hardships and tragedies of his earlier life. But this domestic bliss was soon overshadowed by the immense preparations and pressures of mounting a second polar expedition. Scott's second venture, the Terra Nova Expedition, formerly the British Antarctic Expedition 1910 to 1913, was even grander and more complex than the Discovery. He acquired a former whaler, the Terra Nova, to transport his men and equipment to the ice. The goals were multifaceted, just like the first expedition, but with one primary, highly publicized objective: to be the first to reach the South Pole. However, Scott, ever the scientist at heart, placed immense emphasis on the scientific value of the enterprise. He assembled a world-class scientific staff: geologists, meteorologists, biologists, physicists. His plan for the polar journey itself was complex, a hybrid approach relying on dogs, man-hauling, and experimental motorized sledges to lay supply depots across the Great Ice Barrier. Once those depots were established, a specialized team would make the final dash for the pole. But the planning phase was fraught with difficulties. Financing was a constant struggle. And then, a bombshell. Scott found himself facing unexpected competition. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, a veteran of polar travel, had initially announced an expedition to the Arctic. But he secretly pivoted south, aiming for the South Pole instead. This transformed Scott's planned scientific expedition into an international race. Scott learned of Amundsen's change of plans while the Terra Nova was in Australia in October 1910. The news hit him hard. The Royal Geographical Society and the British public immediately framed it as a race, a matter of national prestige. Scott publicly maintained that the scientific objectives remained his highest priority. But in his diaries, he acknowledged the challenge, writing that the proper thing is to proceed exactly as though this had not happened. A brave face, but the pressure was immense. The Terra Nova arrived in Antarctica in January 1911 and established its main base at Cape Evans in McMurdo Sound. Amundsen's party arrived shortly after, establishing their base at the Bay of Whales, a crucial 60 miles closer to the pole than Scott's base. This geographic advantage would prove significant. While the race to the South Pole dominates the popular narrative of the Terra Nova expedition, it's absolutely critical to understand the immense scientific achievements of Scott's team. Scott genuinely believed that science was the true justification for polar exploration. He saw it not as an afterthought, but as the core mission, and the work done by his team laid the foundation for modern Antarctic research. The scientific program was led by Dr. Edward Wilson, who was Chief of Scientific Staff. The team included luminaries like Griffith Taylor, a geologist, George Simpson, a meteorologist, Frank Debenham, another geologist, and Apsley Cherry Garrard, assistant zoologist. These were serious scientists, and their contributions were profound. Throughout the long Antarctic winter of 1911, while Scott and his men were preparing for the polar journey, the scientists were incredibly busy. Simpson, for instance, operated a meteorological station, diligently recording daily temperatures, wind speeds, and atmospheric pressure. This provided the first detailed continuous weather data for the continent, a dataset invaluable for understanding global climate patterns. Griffith Taylor and Frank Debenham undertook extensive geological surveys, mapping the mountains and valleys of the Antarctic interior, providing crucial insights into the continent's formation. Wilson and his team of biologists studied the penguin colonies at Cape Crozier, making important observations about emperor penguin embryos. They hoped these studies would shed light on the evolutionary link between birds and reptiles, a cutting-edge scientific question of the time. The expedition's photographer, Herbert Ponting, captured thousands of stunning photographs and moving pictures, bringing the otherworldly landscape and the harsh realities of expedition life back to the British public, changing perceptions of the continent forever. Another critical component of the scientific work was the collection of geological specimens. And here's where we get to one of the most incredible stories of dedication. Towards the end of the expedition, a group led by Edward Wilson undertook a perilous winter journey to Cape Crozier to collect emperor penguin eggs. This journey, immortalized in Apsley Cherry Garrard's book, The Worst Journey in the World, was undertaken in near total darkness and temperatures that plunged to -60 Fahrenheit, -51 degrees Celsius, facing blizzards and unimaginable hardship, all for a handful of eggs that they hoped would unlock evolutionary secrets. It demonstrated the extraordinary resilience and dedication of Scott's men, and their commitment to the scientific mission. Despite the intense focus on reaching the pole, Scott ensured that his scientific staff had the support and resources they needed. The scientific work of the Terra Nova Expedition went far beyond mere exploration. It contributed significantly to our understanding of Earth's history, climate, and ecology, setting a new standard for what polar expeditions could achieve. But of course, the enduring image in our minds is the race itself. As the Antarctic spring approached in the latter half of 1911, Scott began his massive logistical operation to lay supply depots across the Great Ice Barrier and up the Beardmore Glacier, aiming toward the polar plateau. His strategy was to use a series of supporting parties. These parties would help carry supplies, turn back at designated intervals, while a final polar party would push on to the pole itself. Scott's transport strategy was, as we discussed, a hybrid approach: ponies, dogs, and experimental motorized sledges, in addition to man-hauling. This proved to be one of the expedition's most significant challenges. The ponies, ill-suited to the extreme cold and soft snow of the barrier, struggled immensely and were eventually shot for food, a heartbreaking necessity. The motorized sledges, cutting-edge technology for the time, broke down early in the journey, proving unreliable in the brutal conditions. The dogs, when utilized, performed well, but they weren't used to their full potential. Scott, perhaps influenced by his previous negative experience on Discovery, or by the prevailing British heroic ideal, had a preference for relying on his men to pull the sledges. Man-hauling, where men harnessed themselves to heavy sledges and pulled them across the ice, was grueling, exhausting work that exacted a heavy physical and mental toll. The march toward the pole began in earnest in November 1911. As the weeks passed, Scott gradually sent his supporting parties back to base. By January 4, 1912, at latitude 85 degrees 07 south, Scott made a fateful decision. He selected his final polar party. Instead of the originally planned 4 men, he decided to take 5. Himself, Dr. Edward Wilson, Captain Lawrence Titus Oates, Petty Officer Edgar Evans, and Lieutenant Henry Bertie Bowers. This decision to take 5 men instead of 4 had severe logistical consequences. The rations and supplies at the supply depots had been calculated for a 4-man team. Increasing the party to 5 meant that the food was stretched thinner, creating a daily calorie deficit that would only grow more severe as they pushed further south. It was a gamble, perhaps driven by a desire to share the glory, or a miscalculation of the available supplies, but it was a critical error. The 5 men continued their grueling march across the polar plateau. They endured temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius, howling winds, and surfaces that felt like sand due to the friction of the ice, making every step an immense effort. Despite the physical deterioration of the team, their navigation remained accurate, and they made remarkable progress. Then, on January 16, 1912, as they were nearing their goal, the demoralizing discovery: a black flag in the snow. As they approached, they found evidence of a camp, and the unmistakable tracks of dogs and skis. Roald Amundsen and his team had beaten them to the South Pole. The realization that they had lost the race was a devastating blow, not just to Scott, but to every man in the party. They reached the pole the next day, January 17, 1912, and found Amundsen's tent with a letter left for Scott. Amundsen had reached the pole on December 14, 1911, a full 34 days earlier, and was already safely back at his base. Scott's diary entry captured the crushing disappointment. "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." The return journey from the South Pole stands as one of the most tragic and harrowing episodes in the history of exploration. Scott and his 4 companions faced a nearly 800-mile journey back to their base camp at Cape Evans. They were demoralized by their defeat, physically exhausted, severely malnourished, and facing the rapidly deteriorating Antarctic autumn. The short window of relative warmth was closing fast. The first major blow came with the death of Petty Officer Edgar Evans. Evans had taken a bad fall earlier in the journey, suffering a severe concussion. His physical and mental health rapidly declined. On February 17, 1912, near the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, Evans collapsed and died. This was a catastrophic loss, depriving the team of their strongest man and a crucial source of manual labor. With Evans gone, the remaining 4 men, Scott, Wilson, Oates, and Bowers, had to pull their sledges across the unforgiving Great Ice Barrier. The strain of man-hauling on half rations took a catastrophic toll on their bodies. They suffered from frostbite, snow blindness, and almost certainly scurvy, a disease whose cause was still not fully understood or prevented at the time. Their bodies were quite literally consuming themselves. As the weeks passed, the weather became increasingly hostile. Temperatures dropped to unprecedented lows for the season, and violent blizzards struck, forcing the men to remain confined to their small tent for days at a time, unable to move, unable to make progress. Their fuel supplies, essential for melting snow for water and cooking their meager rations, were rapidly depleting due to the extreme cold and the poor sealing of their paraffin tins, which allowed fuel to evaporate. The situation became desperate, and Captain Lawrence Oates was suffering the most. Oates's feet were severely frostbitten, turning black, and he was struggling immensely to walk, slowing the party's already agonizingly slow pace. He recognized that his condition was jeopardizing the chances of his companion's survival. Here's where we see the extraordinary human element, the self-sacrifice. On March 16, 1912, during a particularly ferocious blizzard, Oates made the ultimate sacrifice. He left the tent, his famous last words etched into history, "I am just going outside, and may be some time." He walked out into the freezing storm, hoping that his death would give the remaining 3 men a better chance to reach the next supply depot. His body was never found, swallowed by the vast white wilderness. Following Oates's death, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers pushed on, driven by sheer will. Despite their rapidly failing strength, they managed to cover a few more miles, fueled by the desperate hope of reaching One Ton Depot, which was stocked with food and fuel, their last chance for survival. However, the severe weather and their physical decline proved insurmountable. By March 20, 1912, the 3 men were trapped in their tent by a howling blizzard. They were heartbreakingly close to salvation, just 11 miles from One Ton Depot and approximately 150 miles from their base camp. Their food was almost entirely gone, and they had no fuel left to melt snow for water. Dehydration was now as deadly as starvation and cold. In the confines of the tent awaiting death, Scott continued to write in his diary. These final writings have become legendary, not for bitterness or despair, but for their profound human insight. Scott's journals are a moving tribute to the courage of his men, and a reflection on human endurance, He wrote letters to the families of his companions, ensuring their loved ones knew of their bravery, and a final, poignant message to the British public. In his message to the public, Scott detailed the factors that had come out against them: the unusually severe weather, the depletion of their food, and the devastating effects of scurvy. But despite their circumstances, he expressed no regret for the journey, writing, "We took risks, we knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last." Scott's final diary entry, written on March 29, 1912, includes a plea that resonates across the century. Last entry: "For God's sake, look after our people." Shortly after penning these words, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers died of cold and starvation. Their bodies, lying peacefully in their sleeping bags, were found 8 months later, in November 1912, by a search party from the base camp. The search party covered the tent with a snow cairn and a cross, transforming the site into a permanent grave in the ice, a silent monument to their final struggle. The news of Scott's death, when it finally reached Britain in February 1913, caused a national sensation. The public reaction was one of profound grief and national mourning. Scott and his companions were instantly hailed as martyrs and national heroes, epitomizing the virtues of courage, self-sacrifice, and patriotic duty. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, Scott's reputation was unassailable. The publication of his diaries and last letters captured the imagination of the Edwardian era, resonating with a nation that valued stoicism and heroic endeavor. His writings were seen as a testament to British pluck and endurance. Monuments were erected across the country. Funds were raised for the families of the deceased, and the Scott Polar Research Institute was founded at the University of Cambridge as a lasting memorial to the explorers. The heroic myth was firmly cemented. However, as the decades passed, the perception of Scott and the expedition underwent significant revision. In the latter half of the 20th century, revisionist historians, most notably Roland Huntford, in his influential 1979 biography, Scott and Amundsen, subjected Scott's leadership to intense scrutiny. Huntford and other critics argued that Scott's leadership was flawed, his planning amateurish, and his decisions, such as the reliance on man-hauling over dogs and the addition of a fifth man to the Polar Party, directly contributed to the tragedy. They contrast in Scott's tragic, gentlemanly approach with Roald Amundsen's professional, calculated, and highly efficient polar methods, which relied heavily on skis and sled dogs. Amundsen's approach was practical, ruthless in its efficiency, and devoid of the romanticism that often colored British exploration. This revisionist perspective challenged the heroic myth, portraying Scott as a flawed leader whose obstinacy and adherence to traditional naval methods cost the lives of his men. The debate between the heroic interpretation and the flawed leader interpretation became one of the most enduring controversies in the history of exploration, a battleground for historians and the public alike. But the historical consensus, as we move into the 21st century, has shifted towards a more nuanced view. Modern polar historians and biographers, such as David Crane and Ranulph Fiennes, have sought to place Scott back in the context of his time. They acknowledge that Scott made errors in judgment, and that Amundsen's methods were indeed better suited to reaching the pole. However, they argue that Scott's critics often judge him by modern standards, with the benefit of hindsight and a century of accumulated polar knowledge, rather than the realities of the Edwardian era. These historians emphasize that Scott's scientific program was a major, undeniable success that yielded results far exceeding those of Amundsen's expedition. Amundsen's primary objective was the pole. Science was secondary. The geological specimens brought back by the Polar Party, for instance, including the Glossopteris fern fossils found near the Beardmore Glacier, later provided crucial evidence for the theory of continental drift, a groundbreaking scientific concept. Imagine the sheer determination to carry those heavy rocks, those scientific treasures, knowing they were dying, believing in their intrinsic value to human knowledge. Furthermore, Scott's diaries and last letters remain some of the most celebrated and moving pieces of English prose from the 20th century, offering a profound insight into the psychology of human exploration, the human spirit pushed to its absolute limits. They speak to universal themes of courage, loyalty, and the dignity of facing insurmountable odds. Beyond the tragedy of the South Pole, Robert Falcon Scott's legacy is deeply intertwined with the development of scientific exploration in Antarctica. His expeditions laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of the White Continent. He was a pioneer in demonstrating that polar exploration could be more than just a quest for territorial conquest or geographical discovery. It could serve as a platform for rigorous scientific research. The systematic meteorological, magnetic, and biological observations conducted during both the Discovery and Terra Nova expeditions established the baseline for later scientific inquiry. The Terra Nova scientists' discovery of those Glossopteris fossils proved that Antarctica was once forested and connected to other continents, a major contribution to the field of paleontology. Today, Scott's legacy is literally preserved in the landscape of Antarctica itself. Geographic features such as the Scott Coast, the Scott Glacier, and Mount Scott serve as enduring monuments to his explorations. The Cape Evans Base Camp, remarkably preserved by the harsh, dry, and freezing climate, remains a time capsule of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, managed by the Antarctic Heritage Trust. It allows us to step back in time to see the conditions, the equipment, the very spaces where these men lived and worked. In the UK, the Scott Polar Research Institute, SPRI, in Cambridge, stands as a lasting memorial to Scott and his companions. Founded in 1920, SPRI is a leading center for the study of the Arctic and Antarctic, combining research, education, and the preservation of historical artifacts related to polar exploration. It continues Scott's vision by supporting the very scientific work and understanding of the polar regions that he championed, making his scientific aspirations a living legacy. Captain Scott's story isn't just a chapter in the history of exploration. It's a cultural narrative that has resonated with the public for over a century. His life and death have been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films. In 1948, the British film Scott of the Antarctic, starring John Mills in the title role, was released to great acclaim. The film dramatized the Terra Nova Expedition, focusing heavily on the scientific goals and the tragic heroism of the Polar March. It cemented that heroic myth in the minds of a generation of Britons still recovering from the Second World War, a story of national pride and stoic sacrifice. Scott's diaries have never gone out of print, and the poignant prose of his last letters continues to attract readers, offering a direct window into the mind of a man facing death with dignity. Apsley Cherry Garrard's The Worst Journey in the World, which details the almost unimaginable ordeals of the Terra Nova scientists, remains a classic of travel and exploration literature, a testament to endurance that goes beyond even the pole journey itself. The enduring fascination with Scott lies in the human element of his story. His expedition was not a simple tale of victory and triumph. It was a story of endurance, sacrifice, and human resilience in the face of nature's relentless fury. Scott's willingness to risk everything, and his ability to articulate the nobility of the struggle even as death approached, gives his narrative a universal appeal that transcends time and nationality. It speaks to something deep within us, about purpose, about striving, about what it means to face the unknown. Whether viewed as a tragic hero, a flawed leader, or, as modern historians suggest, a complex figure defined by both, Captain Scott remains an iconic figure. His name is virtually synonymous with the history of Antarctic exploration, and his legacy is a complex tapestry of triumph, tragedy, and enduring scientific contribution. So, as we wrap up our journey with Captain Robert Falcon Scott, what are the key takeaways from this extraordinary life? First, Scott was a man driven by ambition and a profound sense of duty, shaped by personal hardship and a desire to make a name for himself and secure his family's future. His early naval career and his connection with Clements Markham were pivotal in setting him on the path to polar exploration. Second, Scott's expeditions, particularly the Terra Nova, were groundbreaking scientific endeavors. While the race to the pole captures the headlines, the meticulous scientific work conducted by his team, from meteorology to geology and biology, laid the foundation for modern Antarctic research. The discovery of Glossopteris fossils, carried back at such immense personal cost, was a testament to his vision of exploration as a platform for scientific understanding. Third, the tragedy of the Terra Nova Expedition's return journey, marked by the deaths of Evans, Oates, Wilson, Bowers, and Scott himself, is a harrowing illustration of human endurance and sacrifice in the face of nature's most extreme conditions. Oates's self-sacrifice and Scott's final diary entries are powerful testaments to the human spirit. Finally, Scott's legacy is a dynamic and evolving one. Initially hailed as an unblemished hero, his reputation underwent significant revision in the late 20th century. However, modern scholarship offers a more nuanced view, acknowledging his flaws and misjudgments, while celebrating his profound scientific contributions and the enduring power of his personal narrative. He wasn't just a man who lost a race. He was a man who, in his final moments, still thought of his men, his country, and the advancement of knowledge. Scott's story challenges us to consider the complexities of leadership, the balance between ambition and practicality, and the enduring human quest to explore, to understand, and to face the unknown with courage. He and his men showed that human beings could endure the harshest conditions on Earth and meet death with dignity and grace, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire and provoke thought more than a century later. Thank you for joining me on Uncharted Histories as we explored the incredible life of Captain Robert Falcon Scott. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden depths of history.